Welcome to Beyond the Council Table. I'm your host, Mayor Nancy Alcock. And what is Beyond the Council Table? I had thought some time ago that frequently our council, we have our formal discussions around the table about so many issues that we don't often get the opportunity in that forum to talk in a more free-flowing way how we are dealing with some of the issues that our community cares about. And we know that there are some that a lot of you not only care, but you're really passionate about. So this podcast is the beginning of, I'm hoping, a series of podcasts looking at issues that, as I said, we are currently grappling with around our council table. It's a way to be able to dive into some of these issues through a more informal type of discussion. So the first one today, the inaugural podcast, I wanted to drill down on some of our thinking and some of the discussions we've had around what balanced growth and development looks like in our beautiful town. And when I thought about doing this, I couldn't imagine a better guest than our current Planning Council Chair, Councillor Bob Stone. So welcome, Bob.
Thanks for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
I'm more than thrilled. It actually, it made lots of sense because I go back at on this issue in particular, and we both ran the same year, 2014. And we were both successful in that run. And I was thinking about this, and I remembered thinking, back then, one of the biggest concerns and issues we had in our community was, well, growth is good. We're lucky we have growth, but too much growth is really awful. And so what are you doing about that? And so I remember trying to respond to people and saying, well, there's a way to balance growth and to manage growth. Lots of issues around that. Do you remember that?
I do very much. I have a lot of people contact me and they say, this isn't the town I grew up in. This isn't the Huntsville I loved. It's not changing the way I like it. And I often ask them, tell me what those things are that make it the town that you love, and we can help preserve those things. We're definitely that rural town that people from the city come to visit to see the night sky and have our lakes and rivers to play in. But we are evolving, and since the pandemic, we've been exploding.
We've been growing exponentially, it feels like. And, I'm glad, you mentioned the character, the small town character. And as I recall, our first strategic plan, not this latest one, but the one before, one of the priority areas was maintaining that small town character. And at the same time, you were one of the big champions in we need to implement dark sky friendly policy. And what's next year? Isn't that next year is...
That's when it comes to full fruition and everything is implemented and the bylaw is fully implemented and everybody must adhere to that.
Right.
And what does that look like and why do we want it?
Right. So I didn't mean to digress because, again, we're supposed to be talking about, ongoing development and the pressures around that. But from my perspective, and as you just alluded to, all of this is related to each other. And so if I can go back to what we were talking about in those early days, one of the biggest concerns I heard were people thought we were growing so quickly and we were beginning to look like Mississauga because they were concerned about sprawl. And that we were developing all of the areas, outside of our town limits. And as I said, they fears that we look more like the GTA and not like small town rural Ontario. And so, one of the things at that time, I think there was a recognition at so many levels that perhaps that wasn't the most efficient way to grow as well, because both at the district level, which is the municipality that's responsible for our services, and in the town of Huntsville, we both rewrote official plans that were adopted around 2019. And both of those official plans said, and that we were approved, redirected in response to a lot of that type of concern about unchecked growth outside of the urban area. They redirected, had policy that said any new development, the emphasis must be on your urban areas. So from Huntsville's perspective at the time, and correct me if I'm wrong, Bob, but this is my recollection as we evolved, your words, right? We said, okay, if we're going to redirect growth to the urban areas, we also, at the same time, tightened up our rural development policies.
That's correct. And so we prevented developers from buying those cheaper lands in the rural areas and driving growth into the urban center.
Right.
And we have seen and continue to see difficulties with larger buildings and larger developments going right next to these small single-family homes.
Yeah. And
that is an issue today, and it's going to be for decades to come.
I want to sort of pick up on something you said earlier. The way I see this, one, our planning policy and our planning direction has been evolving since the time we've been on council. And at each stage, I think we, with our staff, obviously, in a very big way, have been trying to adapt. And one of the things you said earlier, and I think I really want to pick up on this, because this has also influenced the current projects and policy that we're currently dealing with around planning. So the reference that you made earlier to COVID, and what was the outcome for our community because of COVID and the response to it.
We were overrun by these people that had their tiny little cottage here in Huntsville, and they lived in Toronto, and everybody wanted out of Toronto, and they wanted to turn their cottage into their big new home.
Yeah.
And so our planning department went crazy, and we had a hard time keeping up, and everybody wanted bigger and higher and closer to the water than we really wanted. And so this has been our constant struggle in planning.
There, you're referencing another layer that all of a sudden, the growth and the number of people wanting to move to our town. And, it's a blessing and a curse in the sense that Huntsville continues to be the fastest growing municipality in our region. And we continue to have the highest number of planning applications for even though we've tightened up our rural policy, we still have a lot of urban area that is open for development. And so we have a high number of development applications from developers that, even the group of people who are responsible for developing has grown. As you said, people are moving up to their cottages, but it's also looking for new homes because they're actually moving out of the city.
And that, in regards to the pandemic and the housing prices going through the roof, developers that were sitting on these developments, which they had bought the land and got approval for these developments back in the 80s and 90s, all of a sudden it was very profitable to build these developments. And we tragically saw some really horrible things, in my opinion, happen here in town. The beautiful Forbes Hill was wiped clear of trees, and that development went forward, and we had little to no control over that whatsoever. That would never happen today.
I remember it's not only was the community horrified, but as you just said, I remember on council we were horrified. And that brought us to another election. And I know that I spent a lot of time talking to a lot of individuals in our community who said, how could you let that happen? And as you said, these were approvals that were granted in the 1990s. And in a couple of the cases, not only Forbes Hill, but the one on Brunel that's now complete, if they had come to our council today, would never have been approved in the fashion that they were. And in fact, even in both of those cases, not only were they approved at the time, but they were taken to the Ontario Municipal Board. So it was like the big approval, and no way we could have changed that. But what it did do, and this is where I want to throw it back, is it made everyone on council say, well, yes, we couldn't have changed this, but we don't want to repeat this.
Those discussions brought us to implementing our CPP bylaw. There was discussions around
CPP, sorry.
Community Planning Permit bylaw, which is a different planning process. And that was in an effort to speed up developments by, if they give us all the information we want, in 45 days they get their approval. That's the general idea of moving to that direction. But the reason I bring it up is because after the Forbes Hill was devastated of trees, and some other places as well, there was talk brought back about, well, maybe we should have a tree cutting bylaw. Well, some people lost their minds over that. So there was many discussions, many public input forums, and we landed on this community planning permit bylaw, which allows certain clearing on certain areas. No clearing, you can't clear your land for your development before you get your approvals. And we put all these little caveats in place so that we don't see clear cutting anymore.
And if we do, because sometimes I think people feel that, there's some issue with implementation of the bylaw. But, like all bylaws and policies, there are growing pains, and we will continue to have growing pains, right? I think so. But I'm so glad you reminded me about that it was. Do we have a tree cutting bylaw? No. What we're going to do is wrap something as significant in that new community planning permit bylaw. And so now we've got that. I would say, have all of the issues gone away? No, they haven't. And I'll go back to something that we, and I'm going to repeat this because I think it's so important. You mentioned earlier, planning policy evolves. And every time you try and adapt, there might be a new layer. So back to COVID, an influx of people, influx of new developers. But at the same time, you remember housing prices. They skyrocketed. Year 2022, I think it's when it peaked. And the housing prices are coming down a little bit, but it's still pretty high. And clearly what's happened, at least my interpretation, is the whole word around affordability has become very much part of our thinking. And how did our council respond? We said, okay, we're working on planning policy, community planning permit being one, and how we manage the tree cutting issues. But at the same time, I think this council needs to deal with housing policy, which is something kind of unusual. Again, I'll go back to it, Bob. When we were first elected, we were talking about housing, but it wasn't generally, as far as our policy, at local government, that's generally when you talk about either spending money on housing. Well, we know what kind of tax base we have, and is that something that's a bit,
a decade ago, the housing crisis wasn't a crisis. There was a need. And here a decade later, it's definitely a crisis. Now, I truly believe it's not a housing crisis, it's a rental housing crisis. People can't afford to buy homes, but they also can't find a place to rent. If we can increase the amount of rentals, then the prices would regulate themselves and they wouldn't be $2,200, $2,500 a month. They would come down through supply and demand. But right now, there's so few available that the prices are still really high. Now, we've had a few developments come before us, most recently a 42-unit apartment on Tate Street and another one over at the West End that is suggesting 170?
179.
179 units, so rental units. So both of those things are hugely attractive in as far as the need goes, but certainly undesirable to the neighbors who live in their quiet little neighborhood.
A couple of things I want to pick up on that, because I think that I don't want to veer off completely onto housing as a separate issue, because I really feel like we could do a separate podcast on that. But they are so intertwined when we come back to how do we manage the planning of these new developments. So you're absolutely right. The way you left that off, in the sense of people don't like when you say these new rental housing projects in their sort of more traditional neighborhoods. I think you're absolutely. We've heard that, and I think where we are as a council trying to determine the best way forward is to work with staff, and staff are indeed working with us to develop some guidelines as to what might be acceptable for some of these new projects in existing residential neighborhoods. So, and when I say that, we sort of jumped into those projects. One of the things that this council did, knowing that we would be receiving more of these applications, was let's look at our height policy. We've had a height policy that says, as of right, developers can build 11 meters. That's
3 stories? That's correct.
3 stories. 3 stories, as of right. So essentially, and I'm going back to, as I understand it, the issue of increased cost to build. It's also gone up since the pandemic, but also the cost that to be able to sell units and to make them reasonably priced so people can afford to buy them. That's outside of rental, and I know that's a critical issue, Bob. I want to talk about that, but I'm trying to go back to how we're responding on the planning side. One of the issues that, and I believe, I'm going to throw it back at you, was you were one of the instigators that said, our council needs some policy direction as to, we have as of right 11 meters, 3 stories, as you say, but where might it be absolutely acceptable to say as of right 4 stories?
We live on the Canadian Shield, and it's expensive to build on the Canadian Shield, and there's hills and valleys and some beautiful shorelines.
Right.
And so in the valleys, not on the hills and not at the shoreline, but in the valleys, if you built 5 stories, it wouldn't stick out at all, and we could maintain the character of our town.
Can I pick up on that? Because you'll remember when we, years ago, had the application from Hilton Suites in the valley, and they were wanting to build 5 stories. And the other people in the hood, the commercial hood, said 5 stories too many. And the argument that was made at the time was, we think in this location it will work, it'll be just fine. And my opinion is it's just fine.
It is.
To your point.
It looks just fine and not out of place in any way and doesn't destroy the character.
Right.
And so as you were about to say, we as a council have directed staff to bring back a study to tell us where all those places are.
Right.
And where is it appropriate and how high in these areas. And I love that they're developing a heat mapping, which is not straight lines, but the heat mapping through the valleys will show us where it is appropriate to go up.
Yeah, that's pretty exciting,
Yeah.
right? A way to sort of visually understand
Yeah.
where this is going to work. So we're kind of in flux at the moment because at the same time that this policy, we've looked at some draft policy direction, and we know it's coming back to our council sometime in the next couple of months for final approval. But in the meantime, we have projects that are coming forward. So I think that, there are a couple of other things that are really important to talk about is how are we managing that, given this policy isn't before us right now, but we do know there are other ways in which we might be able to respond favorably to some of these projects. So one of them I'm thinking is around community benefit. And that is a term that came out of some provincial legislation, new planning policy, which is also our backdrop, a whole other thing, that this provincial government changes planning direction almost on a biannual basis, which means a complete rewrite of what the provincial planning policy document looks like, constantly providing municipalities with direction as where they'd like to see us go. So that's an important backdrop. But one of the things that came out that said the municipality can ask for community benefits. What sorts of things have we considered?
Well, most recently, the development on Tate Street, the developer offers, I'll give you $15,000 to help fix up Avery Beach, which is parkland right near that development. Wow, that's exciting to me. That's not something that we usually see. So those community benefits are wonderful. I worry that they can... They dangle this candy in front of us to let them do what they want.
Right. And I'm sure, you know what? It's not just us, but the community would worry about that.
Yes.
Because, you referenced the $15,000 for Avery Beach. Well, yes, that's nice. It was one of a number of things, including a bus shelter and bench at the location, which is also really important.
And putting in affordable units.
But I concur. I think that you hit the nail on the head. I think a lot of people would say, yeah, that's not much, if that's getting them this and this isn't a great development, that's not worth it.
Right. So ideally, we can write some great policy, and it's up to us to push back against developers, because developers will always want more. And so you allowed 5 stories here. I want to do 5 stories. It's just down the street. Well, we need to hold, if we have the policies that we've developed that are appropriate, and say this is as far as we're prepared to go, and make it known that no, outside of there, the answer's no. Right. But we have to be strong, because they're going to come with some community benefits to twist our arm.
I think there generally is some agreement around our table that, to your point, we need more rental housing. It's critical. And so one of the other benefits in this particular project that we were referring to on Tate was the developer is out of the 44 units, 42, 44? 42, has said that 10 of those units will be affordable, and is working with the district through their affordable housing program. But even if they are not successful there, they will ensure that 10 of those units are affordable. And there is a definite formula what that means. So people say, well, what does, affordable? They'll use the district formula to ensure they are. Right. So that's a massive community benefit. And the other thing, going back to your standards, and this came out at our council discussion, because we really had a good discussion of we were listening to the people in the community that said, this is too high, 3 is okay, 4 isn't. But we looked at it, and, you mentioned this in another interview. Some of the issues that were raised were that's more people, and we don't even have sidewalks on Tate Street. And we have issues around safety. And from my perspective, I think that council really heard that. So as a response from a planning policy perspective, I think you referenced this yesterday and said something about we need to, if we are going to accept these projects, it's our responsibility as a municipality to ensure that we are making the areas safe where they will be built, and that we're not exacerbating issues that currently exist.
It behooves us to put in sidewalks and street lights if that's necessary, or proper traffic mitigation to help people move around there. If it's already difficult, it's going to get worse.
Right.
But that's on us. That's not on the developer.
And you're absolutely. So I think that's how one of the things we mentioned. And so that's the kind of thing, though, when we sort of the community benefits, people, I can see how they might get uneasy. It's a bigger thing. We as the municipality could say, yes, we recognize a sidewalk there would be really important for the entire neighborhood. So the developer could make a contribution to that sidewalk. That's something that we can do in partnership, but you're absolutely right. The way I see it, the municipality has a we can't be let off the hook on things like that.
That's right.
And so that was important. One of the other things, again, going back to the issue on this one project, was we talked about, well, if we are looking at increasing height, what do we think? You said it would be acceptable if it was in a valley. But I think we also had the discussion, probably if they're being built on a main arterial road. And Main Street, which is Tate runs into Main Street, Muskoka Road 3, that seems like an important factor.
Absolutely. And the preliminary discussions with our height and density staff are telling us that probably is an appropriate place. But we don't have the policy in front of us.
But I do think we did have a healthy discussion. Why would that be? I mean, not every spot on an arterial road, but some more than others. And one of the things that I heard clearly is, people who need rental housing, who may be downsizing, is our growing seniors community. And so to be able to build a rental housing development that is affordable could have a lot of seniors tenants.
And walkable to the downtown.
And you said walkable to the downtown, and that fits very much, I think, part of our other planning policy, which is making our community healthy and livable. So for me, I see the intersection between that and some of this other policy.
Absolutely. And talked about an active community. We're working on, pathways and trying to connect these different developments. We're working with our HMATA organization using the MAT tax money to put the activities in different locations where you can go and exercise as you're walking the path.
The muscle project.
Yes, that's right.
So Dr. Trenholm.
Exciting things to get people moving around without traffic.
Another area that, again, another day, another podcast, and that is our recreational trail and walking path development around town, which is a huge priority for this council. I know that you were chair of the temporary standing committee that looked specifically at that, as well as public transit. So that I would love to do on another day, and I'm going to ask you back for that one, Bob, because that's also another area that you were incredibly active in. So I think I feel like I don't want to cut this conversation off, but I think actually we're running out of time. And really, the way I'm seeing this is, one, this council is very much aware of what these growing pains are like and the pressures are on our community. As we consider things like increased height and increased density in our community, we are also listening and hearing about issues around safety, and if you're going to do that, then you need to address things like that. We're also, though, looking at ways around landscaping and increased buffers. And if we're doing, granting, what's the word I want when you go to planning, a variance, that if we're going to give that to you, how can you accommodate some of our interests? It's all our interests. We want more rental housing, as you said. We want more density in our community. But we're also listening as to some of our other policy, and it's a work in progress. But at the end of the day, we're going to be guided by some very strong development principles around this kind of thing.
And this council is very much devoted to maintaining the character of Huntsville. We can't lose sight of where we've been and what we love about Huntsville, and we need to keep an eye on the future and see how we can maintain that small town feel as we grow.
That's perfect. I couldn't have said it any better myself. Thank you, Bob. Thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
All right. Thank you for listening to the first episode of Beyond the Council Table. And I want to say, if you enjoyed listening to the conversation today, please stay tuned for more deep dives on the issues that affect Huntsville.
This podcast was produced by North Star Networks, the guiding light for progressive media.